All right. So this week we're talking about Zionism and colonialism. First, some news updates from this week um, that you may have heard, but the peace plan, Trump's 20-point peace plan, is moving into phase two because phase one was such a success. Uh, Even though Israel has violated the ceasefire over 1,000 times and killed at least 463 Gazans since that supposed ceasefire went into effect. So now it's moving into phase two, from a ceasefire to demilitarization and technocratic governance and reconstruction. So Trump has put out his list of everybody who's going to be on the governing body, supposedly temporarily. Um, in the West Bank, Ras Ain al Aja, not sure how to pronounce that, but it was one of the largest Palestinian Bedouin villages in the West Bank. And now most of its families have been forcibly displaced by settlers and after facing nonstop attacks. And there's been um, just daily continued killings of Gazans and um, a lot of violence occurring in the West Bank as well. Um, and right now in Gaza, the winter conditions are very harsh. And so, really sadly, this week there was a report of an infant freezing to death. Um, so, to begin with, getting into Zionism, there has been this push, like from pretty early on in Zionism, to equate Zionism with Judaism and with the Jewish people. It's very similar if you think about Manifest Destiny here in North America and the US, using theology to justify its actions and equate a colonialist project with a religion. So, some definitions: Zionism is the ideology that states that Jewish people, as the state of Israel, have the right to occupy and rule the Palestinian land without the Palestinian people. Now, just to be absolutely clear, like Zionists, not all Zionists are Jewish or Israeli. Um, Zionists are just people who believe this ideology, and they can be Christians, they can be people in the US or other countries. Now, Judaism is a religious faith encompassing various groups with a wide range of theological beliefs. Just like similar to Christianity, there's everything from the very conservative and orthodox to more, I guess, liberal Jewish sects. Um, and Jews are people who identify as Jewish based on their religious faith and practices, family heritage, or culture. And not all Jews are Zionist. Now, before Zionism, so Maimonides was a rabbi and philosopher and very influential Torah scholar in the Middle Ages. And to him, he very clearly wrote that Judaism was based on faith. It had nothing to do with race or ethnicity. And the name Palestine has been used for the region that is Palestine for like centuries. And this is important because there have been people in propaganda who deny that Palestinians exist, that the land of Palestine is really a legitimate thing, and that historically, like, it was always Israel. But the name Palestine first occurs in Egyptian sources from the late Bronze Age, and that was continued to be what the land was called. Jewish writers, especially Josephus, understood and applied the term Palestine to the area between modern Lebanon to Egypt. So even among Jewish writers and scholars, they named that as Palestine. Now, religious pluralism has always been at the heart of the land. All three of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have deep connections to the land and, really grew out of that area. So Christianity, even before the Catholic Church placed its center in Rome, Christianity and the Christians in Palestine always saw that land, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, those areas as central to Christian faith. Throughout early Islam, the city of Caesarea continued to thrive as a largely Christian city, but the Muslims and the Christians all shared culture and ethnicity and language and history, and lived together peacefully. The Catholic Church, when it reached its peak of power in the Middle Ages, it began the Crusades, and it called for armies from across Europe to fight against Islam. And so, they went to the land of Palestine and were attacking Muslims, but all the Arabs of the region, regardless of religion, fought together. And the Latin Crusaders occupied Palestine until about 1099. And now this photo, it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built in the 4th century. And it's important to note that, under the what has been taking place since October 7th, even a lot of the, historic religious sites have been attacked and bombed, and including, not only the Muslim sites, but Christian sites. So Theodore Herzl, he's considered the father of modern political Zionism. Um, and he advocated for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And this was back, the Zionism began in the late 1800s. A lot of people think that the push for having a Jewish state in Palestine happened because of the Holocaust and World War II. But this was actually something that was developed in the late 1800s. And they even considered other places for their homeland. They looked at places like Uganda, Madagascar, and even Alaska. So Palestine was eventually selected, um, partly because of this idea that they had um, religious ties to the land, and that, you know, whether they believe that or not, they could use that to promote like why that they had a right to that land. Um, and when Zionism started, a lot of the talk was just um, right in line with and very similar to other colonialist projects. So Herzl even said that the colonization of the land would be good for the indigenous populations. Um, he said that the Jewish state would form part of a defense for Europe against Asia and against barbarism. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress issued what was called the Basel Program, which stated that Zionism strives for the establishment of a publicly and legally secured home in Palestine for the Jewish people. And Herzl was elected president of the Congress. Um, and then the Congress supported financially Jews to go and colonize the land. Now, from the beginning of Zionism, there were Jews who were very against this and anti-Zionist. Orthodox Jews said it was a false messianism, because they saw people kind of replacing their faith with this ideology. Um, there was also um, deep roots related to socialism and workers' rights, where Jews in Eastern Europe had were part of socialist groups such as the General Jewish Workers League, and they wanted to work alongside people in their where they lived in their homes for socialism and workers' rights rather than going and living in another country. And Zionism really took people away from socialism and the workers' rights. In fact, so a lot of the Jews, even when they went to Palestine, they continue to work, and set up organizations, socialist organizations, communist organizations, and they even fought against British imperialism and called for unity between Jewish and Palestinian workers. Now, Hannah Arendt, she's a well-known Jewish philosopher, and she's most well known for her writings about the Nuremberg trials and post-Holocaust writing philosophy about what led people to commit such atrocities in the Jewish Holocaust. Um, she was kind of a Zionist in the beginning and supported Jews going to Palestine um, because of the need to get out of Europe after the Holocaust. However, she was an anti-nationalist, and because she believed that nationalism, by its nature, created refugees and displaced people. She was also afraid that taking people who had just had the trauma of a genocide, giving them another land and putting them in charge of other people who didn't believe they had the right to be there was just a setup for disaster. And she she was right about that. Now the Mizrahim, they were descendants of North African and West Asian Jews. They were understood in the Zionist project as Arabs first, because culturally and, even physically, like they looked and acted as Arabs, because they were part of that land and that culture. Um, Post after the creation of the state of Israel, the Mizrahim really had trouble on all sides because the Arabs began to see them as Zionists and mistrust them. And the Zionists saw them as Arabs who were less than European Jews. In fact, when Mizrahim people immigrated to Israel, they were even put into transit camps, and a lot of their children were even taken from them and given to parentless Ashkenazi couples, which Ashkenazi is the name that refers to like Central and Eastern European Jews. However, over time, the Mizrahim moved further right, as they had that growing distance between themselves and their formerly Arab neighbors. Now, the early colonizers, and again, it's important to see that this was taking place well before World War II. So, the first Aliyah, and Aliyah is the Hebrew word meaning ascent or going up. It traditionally refers to the immigration of Jews from Europe, Russia, that area to Palestine. The first Aliyah was Jews who were not Zionists really, they were religious Jews. They went and they set up farms and businesses and really assimilated with the Arabs. However, by the second Aliyah, it was around 40,000, mostly Russian Jews who were Zionists, and they began, more of the forceful colonization that displaced Palestinians. But many of them did not thrive or do well in the Palestinian land and returned to Europe after a short time. This photo shows the coast of Jaffa, and that's a group of Jewish colonizers, and they used a lottery to divide up that land, and the settlement would become Tel Aviv. And so, it just showed like there they go in, and it's as if that land is just open and nobody's there and it's free for the taking. Palestinian opposition, as more and more Zionists began moving out there and displacing Palestinians, conflict and fights with settlers began to take place. Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire at this time, and the empire even tried to set limits on how many Europeans could immigrate, but it wasn't really followed. They weren't very well able to enforce it. European influence. Now, Zionism throughout Europe and even the UK, it was seen as a solution to the Jewish question. And it was a win-win for European countries who could get rid of the Jews and for the Jews who wanted a place where they could live safely and freely. The US didn't want Jews. Even they set strict limits on how many Jews who were fleeing from Nazi Germany were allowed into the country. Britain fully supported the Zionist vision of creating a Jewish state. And in fact, they were part of the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the State of Israel later on. During World War I, Russia deported about 500,000 Jews to its Western neighbors in Europe. And while they were carrying out pogroms against Jews, Poland also wanted to get rid of the Jews and send them to Palestine, as Jews were no longer seen as citizens of Poland, and the solution to get rid of them was to send them away. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, and the Ottoman Empire had covered Palestine and other parts of West Asia. And the fall of the empire gave way to British occupation of Palestine under what was called the British Mandate. The British forces occupied Palestine until 1918, or sorry, by 1918, and they continued to control the area for about 3 decades. And once World War II happened and the genocide against the Jews in Europe, created this emergency situation for Jews to leave. And so a lot of the debate amongst Jews kind of became secondary, as was seen even with someone like Hannah Arendt, who saw a lot of major problems with sending Jews to Palestine, but didn't see it as a real option for them to stay in Europe either. Present day Zionism, and prior to like the 1950s, most American Jews had never visited Israel. They weren't real familiar with Israel, but that slowly began to change. In 1958, this book, Exodus, was published and it became a bestseller. It was like the #1 bestseller since Gone with the Wind. Uh, and the author said it tells the story of the Jews coming back after centuries of abuse, coming back to the land of Palestine, that is. It was later made into a movie. And that really pushed and facilitated the growth of Zionist support in the US. Hasbara, that's a Hebrew name that is what kind of Israeli propaganda is called. And so the propaganda of what they called the Six-Day War in 1967 said that the war in 67, which was, we'll get into more next week, but it was one of the major episodes of displacement of Palestinian people. But the Israeli army was able to push the Arabs out and like take over a lot of land within 6 days. And so they pushed this as like it was a miracle, and a real win for Israel. In 74, the Anti-Defamation League put out a book that described anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. We see that today with all of the attacks on free speech on university campuses, by saying that people saying from the river to the sea is anti-Semitic, or calling for a free Palestine is anti-Semitic. The calling up of the Holocaust, and saying things like that October 7th was what the Arabs wanted to begin another Holocaust. It's all creates this idea of using the Holocaust and anti-Semitism to promote Zionism. Now, Christian Zionism, I'm going to show this video. It's about 5.5 minutes. But Protestant Christianity, it's really important to note, began in the 1830s. So it goes way back, and was started by this Lord Shaftesbury. He promoted this idea of end times, prophetic politics, and Jewish restorationism, where they're supposed to like return to this biblical homeland, and settler colonialism as Palestine increased. The idea that they were supposed to do that as part of like biblical fulfillment of prophecy increased in the UK and was seen as beneficial to the expanding British Empire. Oops, go back. No, guess I'm going to have to exit the presentation view.
נכון, עשה לך מה עמלק נצטווינו. אנו זוכרים ואנו נלחמים.
This is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu defending Israel's current war on Palestine's Gaza with biblical reasoning. Netanyahu invoked the notion of Amalek in reference to a holy war between good and evil cited in the Torah.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu knows that he depends heavily on the United States to veto any UN resolutions critical of Israel's behavior. And he needs US military support to counter any threat from Syria or Lebanon.
But it's not just Netanyahu. Such references have been echoing in the US for decades. In 1978, then President Jimmy Carter mentioned that the establishment of Israel was the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy.
It actually goes back to the 1960s. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, with the Six-Day War, it was kind of the wake-up call for evangelical, Bible-believing Christians, particularly in America, and it was exploited as the fulfillment of Bible prophecy.
Amid Israel's current bombing campaign in Gaza, the rhetoric has turned more wild. American evangelical pastors who are strong supporters of Zionism just can't stop repeating biblical prophecies.
Israel, fasten your seatbelt. You're seeing Bible prophecy fulfilled in your lifetime, in real time, before your very eyes.
We shouldn't be shocked and surprised that Satan is still at his same goal, because prophecy talks about how Messiah will come back again.
So, what is Christian Zionism? Christian Zionism is centered around an end-of-the-world interpretation of Christianity, the belief in the return of Jewish people to Israel, leading to the second coming of Jesus Christ. It is one of the common factors that binds Christian Zionists with Zionism.
Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism by at least 50 years, and today dominates the Zionist movement at least 10 to 1, probably nearer 20, 30 to 1. For every Jewish Zionist, there are 20 or 30 Christian Zionists. And therefore, Netanyahu knows he needs the Christian, particularly the Christian right in America, Canada, Sweden, Holland, much of Europe, in order to maintain his position and to continue the expansion of the Zionist agenda in Palestine.
And over the decades, this influential movement has dictated US foreign policy when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Remember when former US President Donald Trump made a candid confession during a rally in 2020?
And we moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. As for the evangelicals, you know, it's amazing with that. The evangelicals are more excited about that than Jewish people. It's really, right? It's incredible.
Currently, more than 100 members of the US Congress can be identified as evangelical. Joe Biden, the current US president, has openly identified as a Zionist.
You need not be a Jew to be a Zionist.
There are hundreds of organizations in the United States founded by Christian Zionists that call for public support for the state of Israel, the biggest among them being Christians United for Israel, with 10 million members led by the evangelist John Hagee.
God is getting ready to defend Israel in such a supernatural way. It's going to take the breath out of the lungs of the dictators on planet Earth.
Evangelical support for Israel does not just stop at political lobbying, influencing foreign policy, and mobilizing public opinion, but also fundraising and organizing tours of the occupied West Bank, including funding settlements in the occupied territories, which are illegal under international law. Evangelicals also oppose the two-state solution, believing that dividing the land will incur God's disfavor.
It's Israel's strategy in the occupied territories and in Gaza. It is to depopulate them and steal more and more land. And you know, if you believe that there's going to be a war of Armageddon, that we are on God's side, Israel is on God's side, and anyone who opposes us is on the enemy's side.
And this bias is reflected in the polls, where a majority of Americans are supporting Israel over Palestinians amid the current conflict.
So there is absolutely no justification for the killing of civilians, for genocide, for the kind of saturation bombing we're seeing in Gaza at the moment. And Netanyahu knows that. And so he's pulling out of scripture a verse here, a verse there, to try and placate his main constituency, which is the Christian Zionist movement.
Yeah, wow. As a Christian, it just makes me sick. Um, and a couple things to note, like Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic because they don't believe that Jews are equal in faith to Christians. They believe that, you know, they're going to fulfill this prophecy of Jews returning to this homeland, and then Jesus is going to return and the Jews will not be saved. And so, but you know, that doesn't matter to Zionists, you know, like Netanyahu, who just embraced Christian Zionists because they support this colonial project. And Zionism itself is really dangerous to Jews because there's people who would then assume, as they kind of push, that all Jews are Zionists, and So some people who are anti-Zionist do begin to see all Jews as Zionists, and you know, bad actors. Now, colonialism. Colonialism is domination of a people or area by a foreign state or nation. Settler colonialism is colonialism in which people from a colonizing nation or state migrate to an area and establish residence that functions to extend and maintain the colonizing power control over the area. So this is what we have seen, what has happened with European Jews going to the land of Palestine, creating their own nation, pushing out the people and taking power over the area. Masalha is a historian. There was a quote from her earlier in the presentation, but she says a really important thing, that settler colonialism is a structure, not an episode. So, it's setting up a government, setting up the whole infrastructure and the way things work to create the power over this area. Now, there's been a lot of tools used to erase the indigenous Palestinians and erase their history and their presence in the land. Terra nullius is an expression that means nobody's land, and it was originally a Roman legal term, and they saw, a territory which was not subject to the sovereignty of any European state. It was just an empty land that could be acquired through occupation and settler colonization. So this oh, the land's just there, we can go take over it. A speech delivered at a meeting of the French Zionist Federation said that there's a country which happens to be called Palestine, a country without a people. And on the other hand, there exists the Jewish people, and it has no country. What else is necessary then to fit the gem into the ring, to unite this people with this country? And so, even though the early Zionists, they knew people lived there, but they created this propaganda to just erase that fact and pretend like it was an empty land. And they also, early Zionists, both Christian and Jewish Zionists, imposed biblical narrative. And so there were travel guides and archaeology that treated the land as history fulfilling, what's in the Bible. So they would begin replacing Arabic names for areas with names that were in the Bible and with Hebrew names. So, cities that had an Arabic name are changed to another name that sounds Hebrew or is a name from the Bible. And modern Hebrew was developed by this guy named Eliezer ben Yehuda. And he saw the importance of developing this modern Hebrew as an important tool for the Zionist project, because this would give the settlers a common language and again, tie it back to their religious scripture in a way that, they could act as if, like, see, we have this language that unites us as a people and is connected to this land. And it's interesting that this modern Hebrew, there was even opposition from a lot of Jews. Some of the Orthodox Jews saw using this Hebrew as sacrilegious, and other Jews ridiculed the new Hebrew because as fabricated, because a lot of it just took Arab words and sort of changed them a little bit to make them sound Hebrew. And the settlers also began changing the physical landscape. So waterways, like marshes, swamps were drained. Um, the Palestinian villages were completely demolished. And then there was also, and there continues to be, this great project of planting forests. And this is used to cover up the villages that were destroyed and also create this look that, like, oh, these trees have been here for such a long time, and make it look more like a biblical landscape. Mohi, who will be with us next week, and he will share some pictures, but his family village that was destroyed was actually one of the ones that later was covered with pine trees. And these are just a couple maps so you can see the area and understand the geographic area that we're talking about. So in this one on the left, it's a little further out so you can see the neighboring countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And closer up, you can see the Gaza Strip here, just this little piece of land over here. And then this is what's been designated as the West Bank. Land loss over time. So this is a really helpful visual. So you can see 1917, this was prior to the state of Israel. All of this was Palestinian land. In 1946, when more and more settlers had been coming in, but this is still prior to the state of Israel being established, you can see the beginning of Jewish settlements. 1947, this was under a partition plan put forth by the UN where they divided up the land. This white part was the proposed Jewish state, and then the green was what was left for Palestine. By 1948, when Israel was established, again, you can see the Palestinian land shrinking more and more. In 67, which the Israelis call the Six-Day War, the Great Miracle, they took over, they began occupying even the West Bank and Gaza. And now, well, this map, it only goes to 2017. You can see just the little Gaza Strip and then the little spotty areas in the West Bank. And it's even more fragmented and shrinking since that time, the Palestinian areas in the West Bank. And it's incredible to note, so the Gaza Strip is only about the size of Detroit. The West Bank is about the size of Delaware, which I've never been to Delaware, but I know it's one of those little small states on the East Coast. And the whole area of Israel is about the size of New Jersey. So we're not talking about a large area. And I'm not going to read over all of this, but these are some helpful images. When I share the PowerPoint, like you can look at this some more. But this just shows, again, some of the changes that happened. So in 1922, the white part, this was all Palestinian, and just the few beginnings of Jewish settlers. By 1948, uh, about 480,000 Jewish people settled in the land, and 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, which was over half of the Palestinian population. And those people who were displaced, despite legally under international law having the right of return, have still to this day not been um, given that right. In 67, you see like just such a huge change, and over 1 million Jewish people coming in to settle, 440,000 Palestinians displaced, and by that time, over 1 million were living in exile. And you can just see the increasing changes. The area in the West Bank is starting to get more divided up. By this point, 2008, 5.3 million Palestinians are living in exile. So, okay, I'm going to stop the recording there before we start our reflection.